Well, the 2024 Summer Olympics are just about here. And what better way to celebrate their opening than with the story of how they originated? Today, I want to take us back to ancient Greece and examine the everyday lives of the ancient Greeks who lived in Delphi and Olympia, the birthplace of the Olympics and the centers of major Greek cults. I also want to examine the toll that this status had on the people who lived there. So before we begin, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels. Why am I putting Olympia and Delphi together? Because they were both an example of a common concept in the ancient Greek world, a sanctuary. These were cities that theoretically were not part of leagues, could be visited by all Greeks in safety from interpolis feud, and did not participate in any major wars. Keyword, theoretically. While we can compare the historical records of these two cities, I find it more interesting, and I think you guys do too based on my most viewed videos, to compare these cities archaeologically. Now, this allows us to see two different cities. Of two different cities. Does that mean I'm talking about four cities? Yeah, never mind. Moving on. There is the city we see in history, and the city as it actually was, how people lived their everyday lives in between the various games, events, and, of course, wars. And it allows us to see the reality behind the written fantasy. So to understand both of these cities, we need to look at the Dark Age. I did a video on the Bronze Age collapse recently, and I'll follow it up with another down the line, but one thing I should mention in this video is that this was followed by a Dark Age which lasted a very long time for Greece. This Dark Age did exist around the whole Eastern Mediterranean after the Bronze Age collapse, but it lasted almost 4 centuries in Greece, give or take, by far the longest of any major civilization. Mycenaeans are not heard from again following the 11th century BCE, and Greek records only pick up again in 776 BCE, which is the date of the first Olympics. For this reason, we'll start in Olympia. Now, the cultural importance of the Olympics to the ancient Greeks is difficult to overstate. All Greek records count their years from the period of the last Olympics. Greek records thus make it easy to date their histories because all we have to do is work forwards from 776 BCE or backwards from the date of a previous Olympics we know of from other sources. The Battle of Thermopylae, for example, took place in 480 BCE, which was the year of the 74th Olympics. And yes, the idea of holding the Olympic Games once every 4 years is a revival of ancient Greek tradition. The Olympics were called such because they were held in the city of Olympia, and this was the most sacred polis in Greece with a temple to Zeus, king of the gods. Olympia was an old Mycenaean city. However, not much is known of its Bronze Age history, and thanks to the relative lack of pottery, which, as I'm assuming you guys know by now, archaeologists typically use to date a site, Olympia's history can't actually be traced in the same way. We had to find other means, specifically matching architectural styles with historic records. We can also use graves, but the region of Elis, where Olympia sits, is actually pretty sparse on those too. Only 14 have been fully excavated and studied, and their metalwork was fairly conservative and didn't tell us much. Yet, interesting patterns do appear. The Temple of Hera, for example, seems to date to the Middle Bronze Age, which, if you've been following my other videos, you'll recognize as the very beginning of the Mycenaean era. It's one of the oldest monumental temples in classical Greece, and some claim it's the oldest. The temple to Zeus, meanwhile, is far more famous, yet the iteration you'll see when you go there was dedicated in 476 BCE. And this temple is far more magnificent. The largest temple on the Peloponnese and one of the finest examples of Doric architecture in the Greek world, the Temple of Zeus is a masterpiece of architecture and engineering. Take a look at the columns, for example, which are ever so slightly curved so that you can look up from the ground and the temple will appear straight, fooling the eye from the only perspective that matters, those on the ground. And while this temple was certainly the most monumental, it clearly is just the newest iteration. There is some evidence of dedications to Zeus at this temple from about the 10th century BCE onwards. But I just can't shake the feeling that the Temple of Hera is more impressive for its age. How about you? Is it just an archaeologist thing? Hera's temple is at least half a millennium older, and that does raise interesting questions. For example, was Zeus always the patron god of Olympia, or did it used to be Hera with Zeus replacing her once the Olympics kicked off in his name? Well, it's fun to think about, but there's no real evidence. Indeed, this is kind of the problem with the Dark Age, as a lack of records make it hard to make a narrative. But it's also indicative of a problem with Olympia, specifically the way it was structured. Olympia, in theory, was a sanctuary. And indeed, once every 4 years, the entire Greek world called a truce and competed at the Olympic Games here, where all feuds were forgotten. For this brief period, it was the center of the ancient Greek world. But in between those 4 years, it was actually fairly empty, and it was all fair game. Olympia is interesting in that it has very little local architecture beyond the 8th century BCE. That is to say, the entire city was sponsored by foreigners dedicating their own monuments to the Olympian deities. But it was also run by outside polis. Usually the polis that governed Olympia was Elis. However, there were brief periods where other polis took charge, and they had a habit of refurbishing or even tearing down older temples, especially in the sanctuary, to build anew and blocking the dedications from rival cities. This then begs the question, is Hera's cult actually older, as it might appear, or is it simply that so many rivals vied for Zeus's favor that the older versions of his temple have simply just disappeared? Of course, this model worked for Olympia precisely because the Olympics were sacred and constant. They went on for more than 1,000 years, halting only in 393 CE when the Roman Emperor Theodosius banned them as a pagan practice. Yet, they might have been recognizable. Discus, javelins, and pentathlon were all played at the Olympics among other events as they are today. Unlike today, however, not everyone could participate, and those who did seemed to do so naked. For one thing, it was only men who could compete, and for another, it was only Greeks. The ancient Greeks were incredibly picky about who was and wasn't a Greek, and this tends to make little sense in the modern world, especially looking at modern Greek borders. Macedonians, for example, were largely barred, save for 1 or 2 members of the royal family, and there even seems to be hesitancy about Cretans and Cypriots from outside Greek colonies. There are a tiny handful of examples of pro-Greek foreigners who seem to have bought their way in, which does lead to some incredibly intense debates as to who counts as a proper Greek, as the comment section of my Pella video will show. And as Greece was conquered by outside forces, the Olympics were increasingly forced to open up, especially by the Roman Empire. And the games were all centered around this stadium, which was built in the 6th century. Again, this stadium was very important to the Greek world, especially as a unit of measurement. This stadium is 212.54 meters long, or exactly 1 stade. And Greeks measured their distances in stades. This again leads to some confusion. Google the debate about how Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth, for example. But it does show how culturally significant these Olympics were. And this contrasts to ancient Greece's second most sacred city, Delphi. The cultural significance of Delphi is tied to the Pythia, or the Oracle of Delphi. Now, if you haven't heard of the Oracle of Delphi, get out from under your rock. Also, she was considered among the most accurate and successful prophets in the ancient world, even by non-Greeks. She was said to be in direct communication with the god Apollo. There are some suggestions that the oracle got these powers due to the temple being over a natural gas leak, but that's neither here nor there. Delphi, unlike Olympia, was open to foreigners. Anyone can come and visit the Oracle of Delphi, and some famous non-Greeks from across the Mediterranean are said to have visited the oracle for advice. Like Olympia, it's not known when Delphi first attained sacred status. However, like Olympia, again, it was probably during the Dark Age. It did have some sort of status in the Mycenaean era, but whether this was a sacred status is completely unknown. The Oracle of Delphi was in the polis by the time Greek records begin, however. The Temple of Apollo, the god to whom she communicated, was rebuilt at least 3 times. Delphi, unlike Olympia, did have some measure of local control. However, this declined following the First Sacred War. The First Sacred War is one of those instances where a neutral polis of Greek unity and truce was warred over by many others. Yeah, Crusades. As it turns out, not just a Christian idea. Following the First Sacred War, what we see in the archaeological record is again a decline in locally produced remains, but not to the same extent as Olympia. Nor do we see the same spread of dedications as Olympia. Where Olympia's dedications are usually slanted towards whoever controlled the polis and their allies, Delphi's dedications are fairly neutral. In fact, their council rejected dedications only twice. Otherwise, it gave an even spread to all Greeks. This may be because it actually did have a measure of control over its own affairs and was not dependent on outsiders. Following the First Sacred War in 586 BCE, Delphi's administration was split into 3: the Amphictyonic Council, the Temple Priesthood, and the polis itself as a secular entity. Or, as secular as the ancient world got. It was also following this war in 586 BCE that we see the first Pythian Games. Like the Olympic Games, these were held once every 4 years, but 2 years out of step with the Olympics. Now, you might think of them as equivalent to the Winter Olympics, but they weren't really about sports. Although there were some athletic competition in these games, they were mostly focused on the arts, and women were allowed to compete in the Delphic Games, especially the musical competition. The Olympics were revived in 1896 and were held in the original stadium at Athens following a revival of interest in the classics across Europe in the 19th century. It also followed the excavations of both Olympia and Delphi a few decades earlier. There have actually been a couple of attempts to revive the Delphic Games, however they were never as successful. This may be down to a lack of interest and poor administrative planning, or it might just be that competitions like Eurovision, the Grammys, and the Cannes Film Festival already showcase global artistic talent and make something like the Delphic Games a bit redundant. Together, both of these sites were the most sacred in Greece, and thus it comes as no surprise that when both sites were destroyed by earthquakes in 373 BCE, the Greek world rallied to rebuild them and also pray to the gods. Earthquakes were naturally seen as their wrath. But when this sacred status began really is an open question. The Dark Ages in Europe is a bit of a misnomer. Because we have records from the Dark Ages, we understand roughly what went on, even if it's a bit sparse and not as complete as we'd prefer. It is not a misnomer with the ancient Greeks. Their Dark Age, following the Bronze Age collapse, is genuinely dark. Archaeology can tell us a few things, like pottery styles, orientalizing, and geometric, for example. And while we can see a smooth transition in pottery styles, what does this actually tell? Orientalizing tell us they looked to the east for artistic inspiration, and geometric pottery tells us they started looking to themselves again. They also started making larger, more elaborate pottery, which suggests a couple of things about lifestyle, but at the end of the day, it really just doesn't say anything. At least, nothing that we can form a narrative out of. And, much like Europe, the Dark Ages concluded with what's called a Renaissance, in this case the Greek Renaissance, but again, not properly. While in Europe this amounted to a revival of philosophy, classical studies, and arts and literature, with the Greeks it amounts to their culture just seeming to spring up out of the ground. But we know this was not the case. We know that their records went back to 776 BCE at least, even though archaeology and surviving confirmed history remained stubbornly unknown until about a century later. I've discussed the possible uses of Greek myths as historic sources in my Mycenaean video, but the fact remains, from an archaeological perspective, little is confirmed. The Greeks did have their own ideas of what happened during the Dark Age, and I actually had a whole spiel prepared about it, but looking at it during the edits, I decided it was too off-topic and tangential for this video. Long story short, what the Greeks do say about it, even they have only a vague idea, and archaeologically speaking, it only becomes even vaguer. So with that being said, that's all I've got to say for today on Olympia and Delphi. And say goodbye to this flat. I am leaving England and off to Germany for my new job, the one I discussed in my last video. So until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.